Picture the Adirondack Mountains. It's 1917. A man arrives at Saranac Lake for the fresh air and to die.
Not one for the tourism brochure.
He had tuberculosis. In 1917, it was essentially a death sentence. But Saranac Lake had something special, a sanatorium founded by a doctor named Edward Livingston Trudeau, who believed fresh mountain air and rest could cure the incurable.
Cure cottages for people who came there to die.
And sometimes they didn't die. The man who arrived in 1917 was named LeRoy Upson Gardner. He was 28 years old, an assistant professor of pathology at Yale, and he was dying of tuberculosis.
Let me guess, he recovered?
He recovered. Whatever combination of fresh mountain air and luck and medical care, he beat it, and then he stayed.
Stayed to do what?
2 years after he arrived as a patient, in 1919, he joined the Trudeau Foundation as a staff pathologist. The Cure Cottage had become his workplace, and by 1927, he was director of the Saranac Laboratory. But in 1936, he had a problem. The laboratory was running out of money, and that's when 9 asbestos companies made him an offer.
9 companies offering money to a struggling laboratory. I'm sure there were no strings attached.
Fibers.
And moving on.
The Cure Cottage that saved his life
Became the laboratory that buried his greatest discovery. Yeah, I see where this is going. This is episode 22, the Saranac Coverup. This episode is brought to you by Danziger and Diano, 30 years of turning corporate records into family justice. Dandel.com.
November 20th, 1936. A letter arrives at Saranac Laboratory. It authorizes Dr. Gardner to begin studies on asbestos dust. The funding, 9 companies: Johns-Manville, Raybestos-Manhattan, Keasbey Mattison, U.S. Gypsum, American Break Block, Asbestos Manufacturing Company, Gottke Corporation, Russell Manufacturing, and UNARCO, the Union Asbestos and Rubber Company. Brake pad makers, gasket makers, ceiling tile makers, mining houses. The full vertical column of an industry.
9 competitors working together. That's never good for the workers.
Just like we saw last episode with the trade associations. But this contract had something different, something worse.
Worse than coordinated silence?
Buried in the letter was a clause, and I'm quoting now, that the results of Gardner's research would be the property of those advancing the required funds.
So they owned whatever he found before he found it.
And here is the critical part. Publication would only occur if deemed desirable by the sponsors.
If deemed desirable. They put that in writing in 1936.
They put that in writing. The industry had learned from Simpson, the less said about asbestos, the better. Now they were institutionalizing it, buying the right to silence science before the science even happened.
And Gardner signed it. A Yale pathologist signed away his right to publish?
Money. The Great Depression had gutted charitable giving. The laboratory was struggling. Gardner had been investigating silicosis, a lung disease from silica dust, and asbestos research was a natural extension. The companies offered $5,000 a year.
$5,000 a year split 9 ways. That's what it cost to own a man's science.
He didn't know what he'd find yet. The experiments were supposed to answer basic questions about asbestosis. Nobody expected what Gardner would actually discover.
Cancer.
Yeah, cancer. From 1936 to 1943, Gardner and his team ran systematic experiments. Over 800 mice exposed to different dusts: silica, quartz, flint, and asbestos. The asbestos mice inhaled long chrysotile fibers for 15 to 24 months.
He wasn't even looking for cancer.
He was looking for lung disease. The cancer was an accident. In February 1943, Gardner wrote up his findings. Under the section on cancer, he documented what he'd found in 11 mice that had survived long fiber asbestos exposure.
11 mice. How many got tumors?
8 developed malignant tumors in their lungs. 8 had tumors in other organs. In total, 9 of the 11 had cancer somewhere in their bodies. And then Gardner wrote this sentence: the incidence rate 81.8% is excessive.
Excessive. That's one word for it.
He compared it to mice exposed to other dusts for the same length of time. Average tumor rate, about 19%. The asbestos mice had tumors at rates 16 times higher than average.
16 times, and he couldn't tell anyone.
He couldn't publish. And worse, he knew the experiments had a flaw. The mice weren't genetically controlled. He'd accidentally used a strain unusually susceptible to cancer.
So even if he could publish, the industry would attack the methodology.
Exactly. He needed to redo the experiment with proper controls. 500 mice bred for cancer resistance. 2 to 3 years of careful work. But that required money.
Money he couldn't ask the sponsors for because they know what he was looking for.
And here's the detail that makes this story more complicated than a simple cover-up. In February 1943, Gardner wrote a cover letter to Vandiver Brown, the same Johns-Manville lawyer who held the contract. And in that letter, Gardner himself recommended leaving the cancer data out of the report.
Gardner recommended omitting it.
His exact words, "The question of cancer susceptibility now seems more significant than I previously imagined. I believe I can obtain support for repeating it from the Cancer Research Group. As it will take 2 to 3 years to complete such a study, I believe it better be omitted from the present report."
So his own scientific integrity
gave the industry exactly the cover it needed. Gardner was being honest. He knew the data was suggestive but not conclusive. He wanted to do the experiment properly before publishing. That's good science.
and terrible strategy, because once he was dead, those words, omitted from the present report, became the industry's permission slip.
So in March 1943, he applied for a $10,000 grant from the National Cancer Institute, independent funding, a way out of the contract.
The one escape hatch.
January 8, 1944, a National Cancer Institute committee reviewed Gardner's application. They rejected it, unanimously.
Who was on the committee?
The court records that survived named two voices on the page: Dr. James Murphy of the Rockefeller Institute, the leading American expert on cancer in lab mice, and Dr. Rolla Dyer, the director of the National Institute of Health himself. The committee chair? That's where it gets murky. Most of the secondary literature names Dr. Ludwig Hechtone, the grand old man of American medicine, the founding chair of the National Cancer Advisory Council. But we went to looking for his name in the documents that survived to the trial record, and we couldn't find it there. Hechtone's role on this specific committee, on this specific day, we can't pin down. The NCI grant review files for 1944 are still sitting in Record Group 443 at the National Archives. Someone should go pull them.
On what grounds?
The critique was scientifically sound. Without genetic controls, the 81.8% figure doesn't mean anything. Some mouse strains naturally develop cancer at high rates.
So they were technically right.
About the flaw? Yes. But here's the tragedy. Gardner wasn't asking the NCI to accept his flawed results. He was asking for $10,000 to conduct proper experiments that would answer the question definitively. They said no.
And that meant Gardner stayed trapped, owned by 9 companies who didn't want answers.
The one door that could have freed him.
Slammed in his face. And then?
April 8, 1946, 6 months before his death, Gardner writes a letter to a Johns-Manville executive named J.P. Woodard. We know Woodard was at Johns-Manville because the Federal Asbestos Litigation Court in New York identified him by name in 1991. Gardner wants to review chest x-rays from Johns-Manville workers to see if the patterns in human lungs match what he's seeing in mice. And then he writes this sentence: "I hope before I die, the opportunity may be afforded us."
Before I die. Was he sick?
Here's where the record is precise. On October 24, 1946, LeRoy Upson Gardner died suddenly. The obituary in the American Review of Tuberculosis, the medical journal that knew him best, names the cause: coronary thrombosis, a blood clot in a coronary artery. He was 57 years old.
6 months after writing Before I Die.
The experiment notes filed away. The microscope slides, the handwritten observations, the 81.8%, all of it, property of the 9 companies that had funded the research.
And it wasn't just mice.
No, By 1943, Gardner had documented 11 cases of human lung cancer in Quebec asbestos miners and millers, including 2 mesotheliomas.
Mesothelioma in 1943, 17 years before the official discovery.
Those workers' lungs had been shipped across the border from Johns-Manville facilities in Quebec to Saranac Laboratory.
Shipped across the border. By whom?
A lawyer named Ivan Sabourin, Keene's counsel, the chief counsel for the Quebec Asbestos Producers Association, the man who legally represented the entire Quebec asbestos industry, and, according to Shepard's own account, delivered decades later in a Canadian magazine interview, Sabourin made repeated trips across the border transporting lung samples and x-rays in his trunk.
A lawyer driving dead men's lungs across international borders in his trunk.
The results went directly to Sabourin. The company doctors who treated the workers were never informed. The families were told their loved ones died from smoking.
Did Sabourin ever say anything about it?
Once. According to Shepard, in 1949 he confronted Sabourin in a restaurant. He asked him, "Why do you do this? Why do you oppose the rights of asbestos workers to claim compensation after their lungs have become all screwed up?" Sabourin's answer, and this is Shepard's memory of the conversation 60 years later in a Canadian magazine interview, was, "Because I'm paid to do so."
That's it?
Gardner dies in October 1946. The draft report sits unfinished. And then, on September 30th, 1948, almost 2 years later, Saranac Laboratory delivers the completed report to Vandiver Brown at Johns-Manville, 42 pages. It includes the cancer findings, the 82.8% mouse tumor rate, the Quebec human cases,
The research with the cancer in it.
the cancer finding they now owned. Brown forwarded it to all 9 sponsor companies in October 1948, marked it utmost confidence, and invited them to a luncheon meeting in New York, November 11th, 1948, Johns-Manville's boardroom.
Now hold on. I've heard this story before, and I always heard it as January 1947.
So did we. The January 1947 date shows up everywhere in advocacy literature, in summary histories, in popular accounts of the Saranac cover-up. So we went to look for it in the underlying documents. And here's what we found. The date doesn't appear in any of the court opinions that examined the actual exhibit record. What does appear there is a complete paper trail through 1948, the delivery of the report on September 30th, Brown forwarding it in October, the ABEX medical director writing on November 3rd that he saw nothing in the report in its present form which need cause undue concern, a second internal memo on November 8th, and then the meeting itself, November 11th, 1948, New York. Johns-Manville's boardroom.
So where did January 1947 come from?
Best we can tell, it's a conflation. After Gardner died in October 1946, the sponsor companies reassert their publication control rights through correspondence, not a meeting. Somewhere along the line, that 1947 reassertation got fused with the actual 1948 vote in popular retellings, and the date stuck. The court record tells a different story. We're going with the court record.
November 11th, 1948, the boardroom vote.
They voted unanimously. Brown wrote to the ABEX executive the next day, November 12th, summarizing the decision. All references to cancer and tumors would be deleted from the final report. Brown offered 4 justifications. The experiments weren't designed for cancer. Gardner himself had recommended omitting the cancer question. Gardner's own scientific caution was a factor, and the cancer-susceptible mouse strain was unintentional.
They used Gardner's integrity as cover, just like they always would.
And Brown asked the sponsors to return their copies of the draft report.
Return the drafts, because,
and this is Brown's own language, it would be unwise to have any copies of the draft report if the final report was to be different in any substantial respect.
They wanted no evidence of what they'd cut, except they created evidence by writing that down.
The 1948 report, published 2 years after Gardner's death, ran 42 pages. It discussed asbestosis in detail. It mentioned that tumors had been observed, and that it promised, rather than delay the entire report, further discussion will be reserved for a supplement to be issued later.
The supplement that was definitely coming.
Never published. In 1951, Vorwald and his colleagues published a journal article claiming to present a complete survey of the entire investigation. The 81.8%? Deleted entirely.
A complete survey, minus the cancer. That's not a survey, that's a press release.
The sanitized science entered the public record. The truth stayed in the archives.
How long did it stay buried?
52 years. From the February morning in 1943, when LeRoy Gardner first wrote the words "malignant tumors" in his laboratory notebook, to 1995, when the truth finally entered the scientific record.
During that gap, workers kept dying. The 1957 meeting we talked about last episode, where the ATI voted not to fund cancer research because it would stir up a hornet's nest, happened 9 years after the Saranac findings were voted out of the published report.
They already had proof. They didn't need more research. They needed silence. And here's a detail that makes it worse. In February 1949, 3 months after the boardroom vote, 5,000 workers in Quebec went on strike.
The asbestos miners, what were they striking for?
Wages, union recognition, working conditions. And in the background of every grievance, dust. Dust control was on the demand list. Action against lung disease was on the demand list. They were fighting for the air in their own lungs. They had no idea that 3 months earlier, in a Manhattan boardroom, the companies that owned the mine had voted to delete cancer from the science.
They went on strike 3 months after the evidence was buried, fighting without their strongest weapon.
The companies suppressed the cancer evidence in November 1948. By February 1949, the workers struck for better conditions. The strike lasted 137 days. It was declared illegal. Provincial police were dispatched. The workers lost.
So who eventually pulled this out of the filing cabinet?
In April 1953, a South African researcher named Gerrit Schepers came to Saranac Laboratory as director of research. He'd spent the previous decade documenting asbestos disease at the Penge mines in South Africa's eastern Transvaal. Now he was running the lab that had buried Gardner's data. And he found the files.
Gardner's notes, the slides, the suppression.
All of it. And when Schepers raised what he found, he was told to stay quiet. Later, he described what happened in 5 words. I complied thereafter in the United States.
I complied. That's it?
That's it. He became an expert witness in asbestos litigation. He testified about what the industry knew and when they knew it, but the full account didn't appear in a peer-reviewed journal until 1995.
1995, Gardner's research finally published 52 years after he wrote it.
Gardner died thinking his research would eventually be published. He wrote, "I hope before I die," and the opportunity never came.
If you're listening to this because someone you love was diagnosed with mesothelioma, you already know what that waiting feels like. The waiting for answers, the waiting for someone to tell you where the exposure happened and who's responsible.
Paul Danziger and Rod Diano have spent over 30 years finding the documentation that companies tried to bury, nearly $2 billion recovered for asbestos victims, and their team knows this fight personally.
Anna Jackson is director of patient support. 15 years ago, she lost her own husband to cancer. She walked away from a career in advertising and joined this fight because she understood what families go through.
That's who answers when you call, not a call center. A team where everyone has skin in the game.
Dandell.com. That's DANDELL.com.
The documentation exists. The truth exists. Someone just has to find it.
So what does the Saranac story prove?
It's the mechanism, the blueprint for how you purchase silence.
Step 1, fund the research.
Step 2, own the results.
Step 3, bury what you find.
Gardner's scientific caution, his own recommendation to omit the cancer data until he could do it right, was appropriate given the experimental limitations. He wanted to do the work properly. He applied for independent funding to escape the trap.
He was denied, and then he died, and his own integrity became the excuse.
And the companies met, and they voted. And 52 years passed before anyone outside the litigation system knew the truth.
But there's more.
There's more. The animal studies weren't the only evidence they buried. Next episode, we're going to look at what the industry did with human data, the workers whose lungs ended up at Saranac, and the pattern that emerges when you trace their deaths.
The 70 workers nobody counted.
The 70 workers nobody counted. Episode 23, The Human Experiments.
We'll see you then.
The cure cottage thing.
He goes there to die of one lung disease.
And discovers another one that they won't let him tell anyone about.
It's like if it were fiction, you'd say it was too on the nose.
Except it's not fiction.
Before I die, 6 months later.
His daughters never knew what he'd found.
The lawyer with the lungs in his trunk, though?
Sabarin.
Driving dead men's lungs across the border for years.
And sending the results to himself. Logistics operation, huh?
I stand by it.
Lungs in the trunk for years. Wonder what he told customs.
Internal documents.
Jeez. See you next week.